Imagine spending a decade building a legacy for a family that doesn't even remember your birthday, only to watch your own stepmother walk down the aisle with the billionaire suitor who was meant for you, while you are dragged into the rain and thrown into the arms of a man the world calls a beggar. It's the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart, it erases your existence. But as Cordelia was about to find out, the gutter has its own kings, and some beggars own the very ground you walk on. Welcome back. Today, we're diving into a story of betrayal and a love that wasn't supposed to happen. Before we get into the meat of it, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. The Voss estate sat at the end of Hargrove Lane, like a sentence that refused to end. Were 3 floors, 14 rooms, a garden that had once been tended by Cordelia's late mother Miriam, who had planted every rosebush with the specific intention that her daughter would someday walk through it on the morning of her wedding. Miriam had been that kind of woman, the kind who planted things for futures she might not see. She'd been right not to count on seeing it. She died when Cordelia was 9, and within 2 years, her father, Edmund Voss, had married Beatrix. Beatrix didn't garden, she renovated. By the time Cordelia was 12, her mother's rose bushes had been replaced with Italian cypress trees imported at obscene cost. More architectural, Beatrix had said, surveying the garden with the expression of someone who'd just corrected a grammatical error. Edmund had nodded along. He always nodded along, and Cordelia had stood at her bedroom window, watching the last of her mother's roses get pulled from the earth by gloved hands she didn't recognize. That was the first theft. There would be others. Cordelia grew up understanding that she was permitted to exist in the Voss household, the way a painting is permitted to exist in a room, visible but irrelevant to the actual life being lived. Her father loved her, she believed, in the abstract way that men of his generation loved daughters, from a distance, with good intentions and very little presence. He worked, he traveled, he trusted Beatrix with the household, and Beatrix ran it the way generals run campaigns, with strategy, allocation of resources, and a clear-eyed awareness of who was an asset and who was a liability. Cordelia was, and in Beatrix's accounting, a liability. She had her mother's face. That was the foundational problem. Miriam Voss had been the kind of beautiful that needed no architecture, simple features, honest eyes, a quality of stillness that made rooms go quiet when she walked in. Cordelia inherited all of it, and Beatrix, who had spent considerable money and effort constructing her own version of beauty, found this deeply offensive. Not that she ever said so. Beatrix was too intelligent for that. She just ensured that Cordelia remained underestimated, slightly underdressed at family events, slightly underpraised in front of guests, slightly overlooked when Edmund was making decisions about the family business. The family business was Voss Textile, which had been Miriam's family's company before it became Edmund's, one in which Cordelia had spent 10 years quietly learning from the inside out. She worked in the accounts department from the age of 19. She stayed late. She learned the shipping contracts, the supplier relationships, the gaps in the distribution model that were hemorrhaging money quietly enough that no one on the board had noticed. By 27, she'd written a restructuring proposal so airtight that the CFO had taken it to Edmund personally, expecting credit, and Edmund, to his credit, had found out it was Cordelia's. That was the year Edmund decided it was time to arrange her future. Not because he recognized her capability, because Beatrix told him it was time. "She's 27, Beatrix had said at the dinner table in the particular tone she used when framing a suggestion as an observation. A suitable match would settle her, give her a household of her own to manage. It would be good for everyone. Everyone meant Beatrix. Grosvenor Pelham had arrived in the city 18 months earlier on a wave of new tech money and a PR operation that made him seem more substantial than he was. He was 34, recently liquid from a social media acquisition, and looking for what people in his circles called legacy adjacency, meaning he wanted old money's credibility without having to earn it the old money way. He was handsome in the way that money makes men handsome. Well-tailored, well-groomed, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He and Edmund had met at a charity gala. Beatrix had engineered the introduction. 3 months later, Grosvenor was coming to Sunday dinners, and it was understood, without ever being stated directly, that he was there to court Cordelia. Cordelia wasn't consulted. She found out the way she found out most things in that house. By overhearing a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, standing in the hallway outside Edmund's study, her hand raised to knock, frozen by the sound of Beatrix's voice laying out the timeline. 6 months of courtship, an announcement by autumn. It would stabilize the family position considerably. Edmund had agreed. Grosvenor had apparently already agreed. The only person whose agreement hadn't been sought was the woman whose life was being arranged. This was not unusual. Cordelia had long since stopped being surprised by her own invisibility. What she hadn't accounted for was Beatrix's ambition. Because while Cordelia was being managed into an engagement she hadn't chosen, Beatrix was running her own calculations. Grosvenor Pelham, it turned out, was considerably richer than Edmund had let on, or perhaps than Edmund had known. His liquidity event had been one thing. His subsequent investments were another. The full picture, which Beatrix had assembled through her own research, suggested a net worth in the vicinity of £400 million. 400 million. That number changed the arithmetic of everything. Cordelia watched the courtship happen to her the way passengers watch scenery from trains, present, observing, but with no real say in the direction of travel. Grosvenor was not unkind. He was simply uncurious. He had the attention span of a man who'd grown up optimizing for engagement metrics, and Cordelia, quiet, unobservant, possessed of opinions she didn't always share, did not optimize well. He found her pleasant. He found Beatrix electric. It started at the garden party in July. Cordelia saw it, the way Grosvenor's eyes tracked Beatrix across the lawn, the way Beatrix leaned in when she spoke to him, deploying that particular laugh she saved for men she was interested in. Cordelia had heard that laugh directed at caterers and delivery men, and once, memorably, at a young city councillor who'd come to discuss zoning permits. It was a laugh that said, "You are the most interesting man in any room I choose to put you in." Men never seemed to notice it was a tool. They just felt chosen. Grosvenor felt chosen. Cordelia said nothing. This was the reflex of a decade. Witness the thing, say nothing, absorb the weight of it somewhere quiet. She told herself she didn't care about Grosvenor. This was partly true. She'd never felt for him the particular warmth that she imagined love required. None of the gravitational pull, none of the preoccupation, none of the specific tenderness that made her mother's diary entries so quietly devastating to read. What she felt instead was something more complicated. The humiliation of being traded, the particular sting of being made irrelevant in her own story. She had built 10 years of work into that company. She had shaped herself, quietly and without complaint, into someone capable of running it. And now she was being passed like a parcel between the hands of people who hadn't thought to ask if she wanted to be moved. The engagement party was announced for the third Saturday in September. Cordelia assumed it was hers. She was given the date, told to be presentable, told the guest list would be 200 people from the city's business community. She spent 3 weeks preparing, not for the party, but for what it meant. She made peace, slowly and with considerable private effort, with the idea of Grosvenor Pelham as her future. He was not what she would have chosen. He was what she had been given. She told herself that perhaps she could shape it into something livable. She was good at making things work with what she had. She arrived at the party in a midnight blue dress that had been her mother's choice of color. The venue was the Hargrove Ballroom, decorated in ivory and gold, full of people she recognized and people she didn't, humming with the self-congratulatory energy of a room full of wealthy strangers performing their own importance. She found Caledon Marsh at the edge of the drinks table. Caledon was the family lawyer. He'd been the family lawyer since before Edmund was the head of the family, since before Miriam died, since back when the Voss name meant something it didn't quite mean anymore. He was 61, silver-haired, with the unhurried gravity of a man who'd seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He'd always been kind to Cordelia in a quiet, non-performative way that she'd appreciated precisely because it required nothing from her in return. He looked at her that night with an expression she couldn't read, something between concern and apology. "Cordelia," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Nervous," she said. "Is that normal?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at his drink. Then he looked across the room to where Beatrix was standing near the entrance, wearing a dress that was not ivory and not gold, but a deep, strategic champagne, the color of someone who had chosen not to be a guest. And then Cordelia understood. She turned. She looked. She saw what was happening. Beatrix and Grosvenor stood at the entrance to the ballroom together, not adjacent, together, the specific together of two people who have made a decision about their proximity. Grosvenor's hand was at the small of Beatrix's back. Beatrix's chin was lifted in that particular way she had when she was performing Triumph. The room was turning to look at them. The room was smiling. The room understood something that Cordelia had not been told. "When did it happen?" Cordelia asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. Caledon set down his drink. 6 weeks ago," he said quietly. "I tried to reach you. Your father told me not to." 6 weeks. She'd spent 6 weeks making peace with a future that had already been reassigned. "And my father is in Zurich on business." Caledon's voice was careful, the way voices are careful around broken glass. He sent a statement to be read aloud tonight, offering his congratulations. Cordelia's father had sent a statement to his own daughter's stolen engagement party from Zurich. She looked at the appetizers on the table beside her. Cold, smoked salmon on thin wafers, little mounds of cream cheese piped into swirls, canapés arranged in geometric precision on slate boards. Everything tasted, if you picked it up, of refrigeration, of being made hours ago and kept presentable. The salmon was silky, but somehow joyless. The cream cheese had gone slightly waxy at its edges. This was the food of performance, not of nourishment. Beautiful from a distance, cold at the core, designed to be seen and not really eaten. Cordelia put down the canapé she'd picked up. She hadn't taken a bite. She would not remember being hungry that night. She would only remember the cold and the precision and the sound of 200 people applauding a theft. The announcement was made at 8 o'clock. Beatrix and Grosvenor Pelham read the statement, were delighted to share their engagement. The applause was warm. Beatrix smiled the smile of a woman who had gotten exactly what she planned for. No one looked at Cordelia, or perhaps one person did. Caledon, who watched her with the expression of a man who'd been unable to stop a carriage from going over a cliff and was now counting the damage. She left at 9. She walked out through the back of the venue, through the service corridor, and out into the street. The sky had opened while she was inside. September rain, cold and impartial, immediately soaking through her midnight blue dress. She stood on the pavement, outside the Hargrove ballroom, and let herself feel. Not the performance of feeling, not the managed, controlled, give-nothing-away version she'd perfected over 20 years in that house, but the actual thing. The grief of it, the rage of it, the exhaustion of having been patient and capable and present for a decade and being worth, in the end, less than a phone call. She didn't cry. She just stood in the rain and got wet. She wasn't aware of the man watching her until he spoke. "There's a dry spot under the awning," he said, "if you want it. It's one thing to lose your money, but being replaced by your own family at your own wedding, that's a scar that never quite fades." But Cordelia was about to learn that when you lose everything, you finally have the room to find what you actually need. His name, she would learn, was Lachlan. She learned it 2 minutes into standing under the awning he'd pointed to, a battered canvas overhang attached to a print shop that was clearly closed for the night. He was already there, sheltering, with the ease of someone who knew exactly which city overhangs were wide enough and which were decorative. He was wearing a jacket that had seen better weather. His shoes were wrong for rain. He had a paper cup of something that steamed. He wasn't the kind of man you'd look at twice on the street. Not because there was anything wrong with him, there wasn't, but because he wore his anonymity like deliberate camouflage. Ordinary height, ordinary build, a face that was interesting rather than handsome until you looked at the eyes, which were the specific dark grey of winter harbour water and seemed, unreasonably, to be paying a great deal of attention to everything around them. "You're soaked," he observed. "Yes," Cordelia said. She was still in the dress, still holding the clutch bag she'd been carrying in the ballroom. She was aware she looked ridiculous. "Bad event?" he asked. She looked at him. Something about his manner was not what she'd expected from a man sheltering under a print shop awning at 9 on a wet Saturday. He wasn't performing sympathy. He wasn't angling for anything. He was just asking, with genuine and uncomplicated curiosity. "My engagement party," she said, except it turned out not to be my engagement party. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Whose was it?" "My stepmother's." She paused. "To the man she stole from me." Another silence. He seemed to be digesting this. "Well," he said finally, "that's a particular kind of bad night." "Yes." She stood there. The rain came down hard and impersonal and didn't care about any of it. Somewhere inside the Hargrove ballroom, 200 people were eating better canapés and congratulating a woman for successfully engineering a heist. Cordelia was standing under a print shop awning with a stranger who was treating her, she realized, and with more straightforward human decency than anyone inside that building had managed tonight. "I'm Lachlan," he said. "Cordelia." He nodded, as if the name confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You want some of this?" He held out the paper cup. "It's just tea. Not great tea, but it's hot." She took it. She drank from it. He was right. It wasn't great tea. It was overbrewed and slightly too sweet, the kind of tea from a vending machine that doesn't quite apologize for itself. But it was hot, and the heat of it moved through her hands and into her chest, and something in her body, which had been holding itself very precisely together for several hours, loosened slightly. "Thank you," she said. She handed it back. "What will you do now?" he asked. The question was so direct that it startled her. "Not are you okay, or is there someone I can call, but what will you do?" As if the answer were entirely her own, as if he was simply curious about what she'd decide. "I don't know," she said. "I suppose I'll go home." "Where's home?" "The Voss estate, Hargrove Lane." Something shifted in his expression. Barely, just a slight recalibration, there and gone in a second. "That's your family's house?" It was. She heard herself say it before she'd fully decided it was true. "I think after tonight, it's not much of anything to me." That turned out to be more accurate than she'd intended. Because when Cordelia arrived back at the Voss estate at 9:30, she found that Beatrix had been thorough. The housekeeper, a nervous woman named Pauline, who'd replaced the housekeeper Cordelia had grown up with, met her at the door with an envelope. And inside was a typed letter, Beatrix's signature at the bottom. The letter informed Cordelia that in light of Edmund's declining health, a detail that landed like a separate blow she had to set aside for later, and the restructuring of the family finances, the estate would be managed going forward by Beatrix as Edmund's representative and power of attorney. Cordelia's room had been repurposed. Her personal effects had been boxed and placed in the front hallway. Arrangements had been made for her to stay at a hotel for 30 days while she found her footing. No hotel address was provided. No money was enclosed. The arrangements turned out to be 30 days of the cheapest room at a hotel near the Eastern Bypass, prepaid, which Beatrix had clearly chosen for its distance from the city centre and its proximity to nothing useful. And Caledon would later tell Cordelia that this had been legally reviewed. Beatrix had been careful, and that Cordelia's access to any portion of the Voss assets would require a legal challenge that would take months and cost money Cordelia no longer had immediate access to. She spent that first night in the hotel room with her boxes around her and the sound of the bypass traffic outside the window and the particular loneliness of a person who has just understood that they have been comprehensively outmaneuvered. She didn't sleep. She went through her boxes. She found her mother's diaries. She held them and didn't read them, because reading them felt like something she needed to save for a time when she could afford to feel what they'd make her feel. She found Lachlan again 3 days later, not by intention, but by geography. The hotel was near the Callaway Market, a covered market that ran along the Old Quarter, occupied by food stalls and second-hand shops and people who existed in the city's margins. Cordelia had gone for bread and milk because the hotel room had a small kettle, and she'd discovered that making her own tea was one of the few things that felt like agency. He was at a stall selling used books, not buying, just looking, with the specific patience of someone who has nowhere to be. She stopped. He looked up. "The woman from the awning," he said, as if she'd been a pleasant surprise he hadn't expected to run into. "The man with the tea," she replied. They ended up walking together, which neither of them had planned. He knew the market well, knew which stall had the best bread, which coffee was worth the queue, and which vendor was trustworthy and which was optimistic with his pricing. He had the easy expertise of someone who'd spent real time in a place rather than passing through it, For a man in a worn jacket, he had excellent taste and very specific opinions about food, which surprised her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. "Where do you live?" she asked, because she was curious and had nothing to lose by being direct. "Round here," he said, gesturing in a way that encompassed most of the Eastern Quarter without committing to a specific address. She didn't push. She understood, she thought, what round here meant. She was round here now too, in her way. The evening they had ramen happened on her 5th day without a real meal. She'd been managing on crackers and instant soup from the market stalls. And not because she couldn't spend. She had a personal bank account Beatrix hadn't been able to touch, but it held less than she'd thought, and she was rationing. But because eating alone in a restaurant felt like a thing she didn't have the interior resources for yet. Lachlan had appeared at her hotel, which she hadn't told him the name of, and which meant he'd either asked around or knew the area better than she'd understood. "How did you know where I was?" she asked. "Eastern Bypass Hotel. 30 days paid," he said. "There's only one. Come on, I'm making dinner." She followed him because she was too tired to be suspicious, and because in 5 days he had not once given her reason to be. His place was not what she expected. She'd expected, if she was honest, squalor, the specific bleakness of a temporary or desperate living situation. Or what she got was a room above the covered market, accessed by a metal staircase that was small and sparse, but not poor. Organized, clean in the way that things are clean when someone has decided that cleanliness matters to them. A shelf of books that she recognized as choices rather than accumulations. A table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen that smelled of something already cooking. The ramen was not instant. That was the first thing she noticed. He'd made the broth properly, from the smell of it, from bones and aromatics, the steam rising from the pot, carrying a depth that no packet could replicate. It smelled of ginger and scallion, and something darker underneath, a savouriness that settled over the room like a hand on a shoulder. He'd doctored it, she could tell, added a measure of soy, a small knob of something pale that might have been miso, a thread of sesame oil that slicked the surface and caught the kitchen light. The egg he lowered into the bowl last. Soft poached, the white set just barely, the yolk still liquid gold inside. When he placed the bowl in front of her, and she broke the yolk with the back of a spoon, it ran slowly into the broth and changed it, made it richer, more complete, the way certain things are made better by the addition of one thing that's been waiting to be added. She ate the entire bowl without speaking. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, not just for food, for warmth, for something that someone had made with care and placed in front of her without a calculation attached to it. When she finished, she looked up, and Lachlan was watching her with an expression she couldn't pass. Not fondness exactly, something quieter, the expression of someone who is glad a thing happened but doesn't want to make a performance of it. "Thank you," she said. She meant more than the ramen. He nodded once. "How are you doing?" Really? No one had asked her that. Not Caledon, who was asking what's your plan, which was loving in its way, but not the same thing. Not anyone from her previous life, most of whom had apparently accepted Beatrix's version of events and moved on without finding out if Cordelia had a version of her own. "I'm angry," she said, and underneath the angry, She stopped, started again. "I'm trying to figure out who I am if I'm not the Voss daughter, if I'm not the position I was supposed to occupy. I spent 10 years working for that company, and I can't even access my own salary history right now because Beatrix has the accounts in freeze pending the legal review. She paused. That's what I am right now. I'm pending a legal review. Lachlan was quiet for a moment. You know, he said, what's interesting about being pending a legal review is that they can't tell you who you are during that time either. So, you get to decide it for yourself. She stared at him. That's either very wise or very glib. Probably both, he said. More tea. The days acquired a rhythm, which was not something Cordelia had expected from this period of her life. She'd expected formlessness, the particular shapelessness of a life between things. Instead, Lachlan gave the days edges. He was at the market most mornings. She started going there deliberately. They walked. They talked. About books, about the city, about the history of the Callaway neighborhood, which he seemed to know in unusual detail. He had a way of describing places as if he'd been watching them for a long time. Not just passing through them, but studying them, understanding how they worked and why they'd come to be the way they were. He never talked about money. He never talked about his own past. She noticed this, stored it, and chose not to push. One morning, 10 days in, he appeared at the foot of the metal staircase with a frying pan and a paper bag, and he said, "The bread from Kowalski's stall was good this morning. Do you want grilled cheese?" They made it together in his small kitchen. Or rather, he made it, and she handed him things because he had strong opinions about the construction. Proper butter, not margarine. Knee sourdough from Kowalski, sliced thick enough to hold the filling. 2 kinds of cheese, a sharp one for flavor and a mild one for melt. He buttered the outer surfaces of the bread generously, not decoratively, the way you butter bread when you actually care what happens to it, rather than when you're trying to be seen caring. The pan was cast iron, and it held the heat the way good pans do, evenly and without drama. When he placed the sandwich in, the sound was a low, immediate sizzle that filled the kitchen with the smell of browning butter. That particular smell, warm and slightly nutty, that seems to mean something good is happening in a way that bypasses thought entirely. He waited. He pressed it once, lightly, with the flat of a spatula. He turned it when the first side had gone the right shade. Not pale gold, but deep. True amber is the color of bread that has been properly committed to. The result was audible from across the kitchen. That crunch when she bit into it, the butter-soaked crust shattering slightly, the cheese inside gone soft and cooperative, the sourdough tangy underneath it all. She made a sound she hadn't planned to make. He laughed, not unkindly. "Good bread makes a difference," he said. "You're rather good at feeding people," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not away, inward, like a door opening onto a longer hallway than she'd expected. "I had a reason to learn," he said, and didn't explain further. She didn't ask. Not yet. Have you ever met a stranger who treated you with more dignity than the people who shared your blood? Lachlan had nothing, yet he was giving Cordelia the only thing money couldn't buy, a safe place to land. But Lachlan's rags were starting to hide a very expensive truth. It was 3 weeks after the engagement party when Caledon rang her mobile with news she hadn't expected to be good and wasn't entirely sure how to receive. "Your father has amended his power of attorney," he said. Or, more precisely, he attempted to, before he was moved to the private clinic. He's in a clinic. This was the blow she'd set aside that first night, finally arriving. Has been for 6 weeks. Early-stage cognitive decline, they're telling us. He's lucid, but variable. Caledon's voice was carrying something heavy. Cordelia, your father tried to reach you 3 days before the engagement party. Beatrix intercepted the calls. She stood, very still. The market was audible below the window of her hotel room. The noise of commerce, indifferent and continuous. And he knew, she said. He knew what she was doing. He suspected. He'd become uncertain of the nature of his own instructions, whether things were happening because he'd asked for them or because Beatrix had represented that he had. He was frightened. A pause. He is still your father, Cordelia. Whatever else is true. She absorbed this in the way she'd learned to absorb things that required more space than a moment, by holding them carefully and not immediately deciding how to feel. Her father had failed her. Yes, he had also, perhaps, tried. The truth was somewhere in the territory between those two things, and she didn't have to resolve it today. What can we do legally? She asked. More than you might think, Kaladin said. When Miriam's original settlement included provisions specifically protecting your inheritance from third-party interference. Beatrix challenged them before the freeze, but her challenge was technically deficient. She missed a procedural requirement in the Voss family trust filing. It will take work. It will take time. But the foundation is there. He paused. We also have the question of whether Beatrix's power of attorney was obtained under conditions that constitute undue influence. That's harder to prove, but given your father's diagnosis and the timeline, do it, Cordelia said. All of it. Start it all. She told Lachlan that evening. They were sitting on the metal steps of his building, because the evening was dry for the first time in days, the city cooling around them, the market below folding itself up stall by stall. She'd brought fruit from one of the vendors, a bag of tangerines, because they were cheap and she was still rationing. She hadn't quite finished recounting the call when he reached over, took one of the tangerines from the bag, and started peeling it. Not for himself, for her. He pulled the skin back in careful sections, removing the pith with his thumbnail, separating the segments with an unhurried precision, and placed them on the step between them without comment. A neat, arranged little pile of tangerine segments, the citrus smell of them sharp and clean in the autumn air. She looked at them. She looked at him. He was watching the market below, not her. As if the gesture hadn't happened, as if it was simply what came next and required no acknowledgement. Something moved in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. Not romantic. Exactly. Or not only. It was the specific tenderness of being noticed in the particular way. The right thing, at the right moment, from someone who hadn't announced they were paying attention. She ate the tangerine. She continued telling him about Kaladin. He listened as he always listened, completely. Not preparing his response while she spoke, not managing the conversation toward a conclusion. Just receiving it, the way good listeners receive things, as if what you're saying matters for its own sake and not for what it leads to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know anything about the building at the end of Galloway Street? The one with the green shutters that's been closed for renovation for 2 years?" She blinked. "What?" "Just curious if you'd noticed it." No." She looked at him oddly. Why?" "No reason," he said, but something in the way he said it, a slight tightening, a precision in the non-answer, lodged in the back of her mind and stayed there. She'd been noticing things for days, actually. Small things. The way his mobile, which she'd glimpsed once, had an interface that didn't match a prepaid phone. The way he'd referenced, without seeming to realize it, a detail about the Callaway Quarter's original planning permission that was not the kind of information a person gathered casually. The way he'd mentioned once that the ramen broth required 12 hours minimum, and she'd thought, where does a man with no apparent income find the time and the ingredients for 12-hour broth? The jacket was old, but his hands were not the hands of a man who'd been poor for long. She'd grown up around enough real wealth to know the particular quality of maintenance, the teeth, the posture, the hands. She told herself she was wrong. She told herself she was pattern matching from anxiety, projecting significance onto ordinary details because she needed the world to have more order than it currently had. She stopped telling herself that the evening she overheard his phone call, she hadn't meant to overhear it. She'd come up the metal stairs to return a book she'd borrowed, and the door was ajar, and his voice was audible. Not loud, but distinct, and carrying the particular quality of a voice that had changed register. The easy, unhurried manner he used with her had been replaced by something more efficient, more authoritative, the voice of a man giving directions to someone who follows them. The Galloway redevelopment goes to the council Tuesday, he was saying. Make sure the Meridian filing is submitted before 9, and tell Forsyth that the Eastern Quarter Planning Boundary Review is approved at my level, not his. She stood very still on the metal stair. Yes, all of it, and the Hargrove Lane property transfer should be reviewed before the end of the month. There may be a challenge on the trust provisions. A pause. He was listening. I'm aware. I said I'd handle it. The phone call ended. The door was still ajar. Cordelia stood on the step for a long moment. Then she turned around and went back down the stairs. She walked around the market, slowly, through its closing crowds, and sat on a low wall near the covered entrance, and she went through what she knew, the Hargrove Lane property. That was the Voss estate. More he knew about it. He was involved, in some capacity, that involved filing reviews and planning boundaries and a level of institutional authority that a man sheltering under print shop awnings did not possess. The building at the end of Galloway Street with the green shutters. Eastern Quarter Planning Boundary Review. She took out her phone. She searched the planning permission database, which was public record. She searched for the Eastern Quarter. She found filings for the Callaway Market redevelopment, the covered market she'd been shopping in, the neighborhood she'd come to think of as hers. The filings were extensive. The financing was substantial. The developer was listed as an entity called Meridian Holdings. She searched Meridian Holdings. She read what came up. She sat very still on the low wall for a long time. And Meridian Holdings was the property development arm of the Callaway Group, which was privately owned, which had a private equity wing and a real estate portfolio that covered, by her rapid and still-forming understanding of it, approximately 40% of the eastern quarter of the city, including the covered market, including the building at the end of Galloway Street, including the Callaway district itself, from which the company took its name. The chairman of the Callaway Group was listed, in a profile from a business journal 3 years old, as a L. Callaway. She stared at that for a long time. She thought about the way he'd said, "round here," when she'd asked where he lived. The way he'd known which vendor was worth trusting and which was gaming his pricing. The way he'd known, without hesitation, exactly where she was staying. To Lachlan. She'd never asked his surname. She thought about the 12-hour ramen, the cast-iron pan, the very particular expensive quality of attention in a man who wore it so quietly you didn't notice it as a quality until you tried to find someone else who had it and couldn't. She went back to the metal stairs. She knocked. He opened the door. "L. Callaway," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come in," he said. "There is a specific moment when you realize the person you're falling for isn't who they say they are." Cordelia was starting to see the cracks in Lachlan's story, and what was behind them was enough to bring the entire city to its knees. He told her all of it. Not quickly. Lachlan Calloway did not do things quickly, but steadily, without evasion, and with the particular quality of honesty that had no performance in it. The Calloway Group had begun as his grandfather's construction firm. His father had grown it. He had, in the 12 years since inheriting it at 28, turned it into something that operated in the zone between real estate, infrastructure, and the kind of city planning that happens in rooms most people don't know exist. He was worth, by the most recent valuation he'd been presented with, approximately £900 million. He'd told no one outside the organization's inner circle for 3 years. "Why?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely wanting to understand. He thought about how to answer. "Because," he said finally, "when people know, they stop seeing you. They see the number. They see what they can get from the number, and they start managing you instead of talking to you." He looked at his hands. "I've been managed by very sophisticated people who wanted something from me. It's exhausting. I decided to stop being visible." "So you, what? Pretend to be poor?" "I don't pretend anything. I live here." He gestured at the room. "This is where I actually live. I have an office. I have meetings. I have the apparatus of the thing. But I come home here, and when I'm here, I'm just—" He paused. "Lachlan?" She sat with that. "The Eastern Quarter," she said. "The planning boundary review. The Hargrove Lane property transfer. Your family's estate is adjacent to a property I'm acquiring as part of the Galloway redevelopment plan. The legal complexity around the Voss family trust was flagged to me, not personally, through the legal team. Your name came up in the context of the challenge to Beatrix's power of attorney." He was watching her carefully. "I knew before I met you under the awning." She felt the edge of something she was deciding whether to be angry about. "You knew who I was. I knew your name was attached to a legal file. I didn't know you were the woman standing in the rain outside the Hargrove ballroom." He paused. "Cordelia, when I saw you that night, I didn't know any of this was connected. That took me 3 days to piece together, and by then we'd already—" He stopped. "Already what?" He looked at her in that way he had, the harbor gray eyes, the quality of attention that cost something to be on the receiving end of. "Become people who mattered to each other," he said, "in some small way." She sat with that too. "You could have told me," she said. I know. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the first thing you ever said to me was told entirely honestly, to a stranger who had nothing, and you didn't change anything about yourself in the telling. No performance, no management. You were just—" He seemed to reach for the word and find only the true one. "Yourself. I hadn't had a conversation like that in 3 years. I didn't want it to stop." She looked at him. The anger she'd reached for hadn't quite arrived, or it had arrived and found something else already occupying the space. Sitting in that small room, with its organized shelves, and its smell of the market below, and the memory of everything he'd fed her without asking for anything back, she was doing the arithmetic of the last 4 weeks and finding it different from what she'd assumed. He had known who she was, in the abstract, legal sense, from the 3rd day. He had chosen to shelter her from the rain. He had made her ramen. He had peeled her tangerine. He had listened to her without agenda, without the management she'd experienced all her life from people who wanted something. He had, she was now understanding, been protecting her. Not in the paternalistic, disempowering sense, but in the way that a person protects something they value, by not bringing the weight of their own power down on it. "Does Beatrix know who you are?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. "She's been trying to find out." "What do you mean?" He stood up and went to a drawer in the kitchen, from which he retrieved a manila envelope. He placed it on the table, in front of her. "Your stepmother has been attempting, and through 3 separate intermediaries, to make contact with the Callaway Group about a property investment. She believes the Eastern Quarter redevelopment represents an opportunity." He paused. "She has been trying to find her way to me for 6 weeks. Cordelia stared at the envelope. "She doesn't know you're the beggar she had me thrown to." "She does not." She opened the envelope. Inside were financial documents, summaries of Beatrix's recent money movements, the kind of documentation that required someone with institutional resources to compile. She looked up at him. "How long have you been watching her?" she asked. "Since the first day I found out your name was attached to that trust challenge," he said. "I have lawyers, Cordelia. I have resources. When I understood what had been done to you—" He stopped. When he continued, his voice was quieter. "I've been in a position before where someone with power and no conscience decided that what I had was theirs. I know what it costs. I didn't want to watch it happen to you without at least—" He chose the word deliberately, understanding it fully. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the market had completely closed now. The quarter was settling into its nighttime version. Quieter. The particular hush of a neighborhood that knows itself. Below them, the city that Lachlan Callaway had been quietly rebuilding for a decade carried on its business without knowing he was up here, in a small room with a cast-iron pan and a shelf of books, telling the truth to a woman who'd been told very little of it in her life. "What's in the documents?" she asked. "Evidence," he said, "that Beatrix's financial position is significantly weaker than she has represented to Grosvenor. Her property holdings, 3 of them, are financed against the Voss estate, which she does not fully own and cannot legitimately pledge. The mortgages are in technical default." He paused. "Grosvenor doesn't know this. He is, however, about to find out, because the bank holding the mortgages is due to send notices of default at the end of the month." Cordelia stared at him. "And the Voss estate itself," she said carefully, "is the subject of a trust provision that Caledon Marsh filed correctly last week, which supersedes Beatrix's power of attorney on property matters specifically, which means the estate cannot be sold, transferred, or mortgaged further without your explicit consent." She sat back. "You talked to Caledon," she said. "Caledon found me," Lachlan said. "He's been the Voss family lawyer for 30 years. He remembered your mother. He wanted to make sure someone with resources was aware of the full picture." A pause. "He's a good man." "He is," she agreed. She looked at the envelope, at the documents that contained, in their careful rows of figures, the structural collapse of everything Beatrix had built. Not her doing, or not only. The edifice was rotten from inside. Beatrix had leveraged a foundation that was never legally hers, and the weight of her own ambition was now settling unevenly onto the cracks. "She's going to lose everything," Cordelia said, not triumphantly, just stating the fact, testing its weight. "Yes," Lachlan said, "and Grosvenor, when he understands the financial picture, is likely to—" "Exit," Cordelia said. "Efficiently," he agreed. He's not a man who tolerates uncertain balance sheets." A silence. Then Cordelia felt the beginnings of something strange, not quite laughter, Something more complicated. The particular sensation of a story arriving at its reckoning. The way a held breath finally releases. She felt it move through her and settle somewhere she couldn't name. The phone call came from Beatrix at 11 o'clock the following morning. There is nothing more satisfying than watching a bully realize they've walked into a trap they set for themselves. Beatrix came to laugh at Cordelia, but she was about to find out that the beggar she mocked actually held the keys to her bankruptcy. The meeting was Beatrix's idea. She had learned, through the intermediaries who'd been working their way toward Lachlan, and that the mysterious investor at the center of the Callaway Group's Eastern Quarter plans had some connection to Cordelia Voss, the stepdaughter she'd managed out of the family home 6 weeks earlier. The information was incomplete, which was how she preferred to operate. Beatrix did her best work in information gaps, filling them with the narrative most useful to her. She called Cordelia's mobile, which Cordelia answered on the third ring. "I think we should talk," Beatrix said, "now that the initial difficulties have settled." "Have they settled?" Cordelia asked. "These things always do," Beatrix said, and she was using the voice, the warm, reasonable, where both adults' voice she deployed when she needed to flatten conflict into compliance. "You're angry, and I understand that. But Grosvenor and I—" A careful pause. "We care about you, Cordelia. And with your father's situation, it would be so much better for everyone to approach this as a family." Cordelia said nothing for a moment. "All right," she said. "Let's meet. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. The Callaway House Cafe." She gave the address, a cafe that occupied the ground floor of a Callaway Group property on the main Galloway Street, beautiful and well-run, that Beatrix would not recognize as significant. She told Lachlan. He said nothing, but something in his expression had the quality of a hand of cards being played. The afternoon of the meeting arrived cool and clear. The Callaway House Cafe was full of golden late October light, its interior warm and smelling of coffee and something baked, a dense spiced apple cake that sat under a glass dome on the counter, and each slice the particular perfect amber of fruit that has been cooked slowly with good butter and patience. Cordelia arrived first. She ordered tea. Beatrix arrived 10 minutes late, which was always intentional, and looked around the cafe with the practiced eye of a woman assessing the quality of a room. She found it acceptable, attractive, clearly well-financed, and sat down across from Cordelia with the composed expression of a person who believes they hold the advantage. She did not know that Lachlan was already in the cafe, sitting at a corner table with his phone and a cup of coffee, wearing the worn jacket, not performing anything, just being there. Beatrix hadn't noticed him. Why would she? He was nobody. "You look well," Beatrix said to Cordelia, which was her way of indicating that Cordelia looked worse than expected, and this pleased her. "I'm fine," Cordelia said. The conversation moved, as Beatrix steered it, toward the supposed purpose of the meeting. The family situation, the estate, the need for cooperation during Edmund's difficult period. Beatrix's manner was the distilled product of 30 years of managing people. Smooth, warm, and carrying an undercurrent of threat so well disguised that you could almost miss it. Almost. Cordelia had been studying this particular performance for 20 years. She knew every instrument in the orchestra. "Of course," Beatrix said, sipping her coffee, "a legal challenge would be exhausting for everyone. Your father is not well. A protracted dispute at this time would be very inconvenient for you," Cordelia said pleasantly. Beatrix's eyes sharpened. "I'm thinking of Edmund." You've been thinking of Edmund's power of attorney, Cordelia said, which has now been successfully restricted in its scope on property matters, as I imagine your solicitor has advised you. A pause. The faintest recalibration. These things are always more complex than… Beatrix. Cordelia set down her tea. Your 3 property holdings are in default. The bank sends notice at the end of the month. Grosvenor doesn't know the extent of your debt structure, and the Voss estate, which you've pledged against 2 of those mortgages, cannot be sold without my consent. The warmth drained out of Beatrix's face, the way heat leaves a room when someone opens a winter door. Where did you… I have good lawyers, Cordelia said, and good friends. This was the moment Lachlan got up from his corner table and came to stand at the edge of theirs. He didn't hurry, he just arrived, coffee in hand, and looked at Beatrix with the grey eyes that in this context had the quality of harbour water in a squall. Mrs. Voss Pelham, he said, I believe we've been trying to arrange a meeting through your intermediaries, Lachlan Calloway. The silence that followed was of the very specific variety that happens when a person understands that the landscape they're standing on is not the landscape they thought it was. Beatrix looked at him. She looked at the worn jacket. She looked at Cordelia. She looked back at him. The Calloway Group, she said. Her voice had gone very flat. Yes, he said. Shall we talk about the Eastern Quarter redevelopment? I understand you've been interested in investment opportunities. What followed was not dramatic. There was no raised voice, no visible collapse. Beatrix was not the kind of woman who collapsed visibly. But there was a quality to the silence after Lachlan laid out the structure of what he knew. The mortgages, the defaults, the trust provisions, the timeline. That was its own variety of devastation. The silence of someone realizing that the ground they've been walking on is not ground. The restructuring of the Voss family trust was completed 3 weeks later, with Caledon Marsh filing the final provisions. Edmund, from his private clinic, had regained sufficient lucidity during a period of stability to sign a revised and witness statement about his original intentions. Beatrix, advised by her solicitor of the extent of her legal exposure, though had agreed, without warmth, without grace, but nonetheless agreed, to the financial settlement that Caledon proposed. She kept the engagement to Grosvenor for what it was worth. He stayed for slightly longer than Cordelia had expected, which said something either about his affection or his remaining optimism about the balance sheet. He left in December. Cordelia did not feel the satisfaction she'd imagined for that particular piece of news. She felt mostly tired and relieved and curious about what came next. The first dinner they had that wasn't necessity was a Sunday in November. Lachlan's kitchen, the small room above the market, which she'd come to know in a way she'd come to know very few places, not because it was grand, but because things that mattered had happened in it. He'd been cooking since the morning, but which she knew because she'd arrived at noon and found him already tending the pot on the stove with the attention he gave to things he cared about. It was beef stew, though that word, stew, was inadequate for what he'd built. He'd started with chuck, seared until it was the color of mahogany, the fat rendered and caramelized in a cast-iron pan that was her old friend by now, then onions, softened to translucency, then stock, the real kind, made from bones, the color of good amber when he held a ladle of it to the window light, root vegetables, a handful of fresh thyme, the lid on low, and then the patient hours of it. By the time they ate, the kitchen smelled like something that could almost be the word home, if you were willing to let it be. Not the Voss estate home. Nothing like that. Nothing architectural or imposed. The smell of warmth and slowness and effort freely given, of something that had been looked after. The beef yielded to a fork with no resistance, the collagen in it having dissolved into a sauce that coated everything it touched with a richness you felt in your chest. The vegetables had absorbed the stock and given something of themselves back to it. The bread she'd brought from Kowalski, because she knew which vendor was worth trusting now, soaked it up and became something better than it had been. They talked through most of it, not about the legal situation, which was resolving itself in the patient bureaucratic way of things that have been correctly filed, not about money or the future, or any of the large-scale matters that had occupied her last months. They talked about books, about the city's history, about his grandfather, who had built the first Callaway building with his own hands and left a plaque on its foundation that said, "Built with honest materials," about her mother, who had planted rose bushes for futures she trusted without needing to see. "She sounds like someone who understood something essential," Lachlan said. "She understood that things grow if you tend them," Cordelia said. "She would have liked you." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "Would she have liked what you're doing now? Rebuilding something that was taken from me. Starting something new," he said. "That has nothing to do with what was taken." She looked at him across the table, in the kitchen that smelled like home, and the autumn evening light coming through the small window at the kind of angle that makes ordinary rooms look like paintings. She thought about the decade she'd spent making herself useful to a family that had not been looking for her. She thought about the engagement that hadn't been hers. She thought about standing in the rain, outside a ballroom in a midnight blue dress with nothing in her hands. She thought about a paper cup of tea that wasn't great tea, offered by someone who had nothing to gain from the offering. "Yes," she said, "I think she would have." The victory, and she allowed herself, in private the word, came through, not in a single moment, but in the accumulated resolution of several things at once. The trust restoration, the access to her portion of the Voss inheritance, which turned out to be considerably more substantial than Beatrix had represented. The CFO of Voss Textile, and who had not entirely forgotten, whose restructuring proposal had saved the company $200,000 annually, who reached out in December with a question about whether she was available for consultation. And then there was the dinner. Caledon had called it a meeting to review the final settlement documentation, which was technically accurate and entirely insufficient as a description. He'd booked the private room at the Callaway house, the nicer version, the one upstairs, which Lachlan had designed with the specific intention of being a place where things that deserved proper attention could receive it. Cordelia arrived to find Caledon already there, looking pleased with himself in the manner of a man whose life's work has produced the outcome he intended. And Lachlan. And to her complete surprise, it's her father, seated at the far end of the table, smaller than she remembered him, with the quality that serious illness gives people of being more themselves than they were before. All the performance boiled away. Edmund Voss looked at his daughter across the table, and his eyes filled, which she had never seen in her life. "I'm sorry, Cordelia," he said. "It was insufficient. It was also real." She sat beside him. She took his hand. She held it while the rest of the room gave them a moment by looking elsewhere, which was generous. "We'll talk properly," she told him, "when you're stronger." The food that evening was the product of a kitchen that understood what the occasion required. Not the cold precision of the engagement party canapés, not the endurance food of hard weeks, but something celebratory and nourishing at the same time. The kind of cooking that says, "This mattered, and so do you." A slow, roasted lamb that had been in the oven since morning, its crust fragrant with rosemary and garlic, the meat inside tender enough to pull apart with 2 spoons. Roasted root vegetables that had caramelized at their edges into something more than their ingredients. A sauce built from the roasting juices that was complex and deep, and the color of garnets. The bread was Kowalski's. Lachlan had arranged it, which Cordelia found unexpectedly moving. That specific detail, that he'd remembered which bread she trusted. There was wine and warmth, and the particular atmosphere of a room full of people who have come through something difficult and are recognizing, without having to state it, that they are on the other side of it. Caledon gave a brief and well-chosen speech about Miriam Voss, who had planted rose bushes for futures she trusted. Edmund held Cordelia's hand for most of the evening. Lachlan sat across from her and watched her, the way he always watched her, with that particular quality of attention that had nothing in it to defend against. Nothing calculating, nothing managed, just him, looking at her, with the harbor gray eyes and the expression of a man who'd been alone in his real life for a long time and had found, against the odds, someone he didn't have to perform for. The dessert was a fig and almond tart, caramelized, warm, the figs split and honey dark, the almond cream beneath them set to a dense sweetness that balanced against the fruit. With the kind of dessert you finish slowly because you're not in a hurry to be done with it. Cordelia was not in a hurry to be done with any of it. After dinner, she and Lachlan stood on the upstairs terrace while the others finished their wine inside. The city below them was what it always was, indifferent, continuous, full of its own commerce and history and private reckonings. The Eastern Quarter was lit differently than it used to be. The redevelopment had changed the lighting plan, which was something Lachlan had apparently spent considerable time on, because he felt that the quality of light in a neighborhood shaped how people felt about being in it. "You think about everything, don't you?" she said. "Some things," he said. "Not everything. I hadn't thought about any of this." He gestured vaguely between them. "No plans?" she asked. "More none," he confirmed. "For once?" She leaned on the terrace railing. The city moved below. "My mother planted rose bushes for a future she couldn't see," she said. "I used to think that was sad, that she was making plans for someone else's life. And now? Now I think she understood that some things need to be started before you know where they're going." She looked at him. "I'm starting something. I don't know entirely where it's going." "The Voss textile consultation," he said. "That too," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the way he had, the way she'd been on the receiving end of since a wet September night outside a stolen engagement party, which felt from here both very close and very far away. Then he turned back to the city, and they stood together on the terrace in the November cold, in close enough that their arms were touching, looking out at a place they'd both, in different ways, been rebuilding. Below them, the covered market was dark and closed. The building on Galloway Street, with the green shutters, had acquired scaffolding and new light. The Calloway Quarter hummed with its nighttime life. The Voss estate on Hargrove Lane was legally hers again, or partly hers, in the complicated truth of shared inheritance and pending conversations with a father who owed her more than a statement from Zurich. None of it was finished. Most of it was just beginning. That, she thought, was the correct state of things to be in. There is a kind of love that announces itself in grand gestures and expensive settings, And then there is a kind that arrives in a paper cup of overbrewed tea in the rain outside a ballroom where you've just lost everything you thought was yours. One of them is much easier to see coming. The other one, by the time you notice it, has already become something you couldn't imagine being without. Cordelia Voss would not have said she'd found love in a gutter. She'd say she found it in a man who treated her like someone whose thoughts were worth listening to, who peeled a tangerine without ceremony and placed it on a step beside her, who made 12-hour ramen on a Tuesday evening for no reason except that she looked like she needed warmth. She'd say the gutter had nothing to do with it. The gutter was just where the story happened to start. That was the journey of Cordelia and Lachlan. And from being thrown to the streets to finding a love that was truly priceless. What part made you cheer the loudest? Was it the reveal or seeing Beatrix finally get what she deserved? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that hit right at home. See you next time.